Can you see the screen where it says hearing Srimad Bhagavatam?
Yes, Maharaj.
Okay, good. Because in my screen it's backwards. I chose to use the topic hearing Srimad Bhagavatam as opposed to reading Srimad Bhagavatam, but they're the same because when the subject of Srimad Bhagavatam is meant to be heard by someone who is a qualified speaker, here's a nice drawing of Srila Prabhupada speaking Srimad Bhagavatam. And here's a nice statement Prabhupada made about hearing Srimad Bhagavatam from Canto 2, Chapter 8. Srimad Bhagavatam is certainly a very dear scripture for all the devotees of the Lord. But it is auspicious even for the non-devotees also, because it explains that even the non-devotees hovering under the spell of the material energy can be delivered from the clutches if they hear the narration of Srimad Bhagavatam with devotion and attention from the right source, representing the Lord by disciplic succession. As we know, Srila Prabhupada brought Canto 1 Srimad Bhagavatam with him. That was part of the preparation that he carried out before coming to the West under the order of Bhaktisiddhanta to bring the teachings of Lord Chaitanya to the English-speaking parts of the world. And guess what? The Srimad Bhagavatam is non-different than the teachings of Lord Chaitanya and vice versa. So he had a pair of kartals in Srimad Bhagavatam and a vision and enormous faith. And with that combination, he began the Hare Krishna movement, resting on the holy name and the teachings of Srimad Bhagavatam. Let's go up the chain of disciplic succession a bit. Here's a nice statement by Bhaktisiddhanta, written in the book, No Other Book Like the Bhagavad. Listen to this. Even if all the books of the world were to be burned, there would be no harm, provided one treatise was left, Srimad Bhagavatam. Even if thousands of learning centers were to be abolished, there would be no feeling of inconvenience, provided the reading and teaching of Srimad Bhagavatam continued. There are no other books in the world like Srimad Bhagavatam. This is not mere tittle-tattle or an exaggerated homage. If one reflects on it as a truly impartial judge, one will realize that there has not been, nor will there ever be, a book like the Bhagavatam. Now that he wrote in Sri Chaitanya's teachings, which is what Srila Prabhupada brought to America to give the teachings of Lord Chaitanya to the English-speaking parts of the world. It's a unexcelled, unequaled literature, even amongst all of the wonderful literature found in the Vedic texts. Listen to Bhakti Vinod Thakur's eulogy. It's similarly very interesting. From Pranava or Om came Gayatri. From Gayatri came the Vedas. From the Vedas came the Brahma Sutra. And from the Brahma Sutra came the Srimad Bhagavatam, which has brightly risen like a Satchidananda sun. Those who have eyes should see, those who have ears should hear, and those who have minds should meditate on the topics of Srimad Bhagavatam. Very wonderful statement. The Bhagavatam, glorified by Bhaktivinoda Thakur. Continuing up the disciplic line, here's a painting of Sanatan Goswami. Nice story. When Sanatan Goswami was young, in a dream, a Brahmin appeared to him. And much to his surprise, the Brahmana gave him a Srimad Bhagavatam. Now, in those days, there was no BBT, no printing press. It was, as you know, how literatures looked. It was on leaf bound in rope and so forth, handwritten. But he was given a Bhagavatam in his dream. And he was very surprised when he woke up. However, later that same morning, the same Brahmana came and gave him the Srimad Bhagavatam. So from a young age, here's Srimad Bhagavatam in his hand, and he, being the Vaishnava that he was, he became ecstatic and merged into an ocean of prema. After this incident took place, Sanatana began reading Srimad Bhagavatam daily.
Maharaj, sorry to interrupt you.
Later in his life, when Sanatan Goswami was around in his late 20s, 27, 28, that's when they had association. He and his brother Rupa had association with Lord Chaitanya, who thoroughly instructed him. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu gave personal instructions to Sanatana about the essence of Srimad Bhagavatam. Based on those instructions, Sanatana wrote books. Digdarshini Tika, a commentary on Hari Bhakti Vilas, Vaishnava Toshini, and this wonderful Brihat Bhagavatamrita.
Hare Krishna Maharaj.
But it doesn't stop there. Sanatan Goswami, one of his writings directly glorifies Srimad Bhagavatam. It's Krishna Lila Stava. Here's some of the verses that are directly, specifically, explicitly glorifying Srimad Bhagavatam. Notice the word sarva many times. Sarva shastrabdhi piyusha, sarva vedika sat pala, sarva siddhanta ratnadya, sarva lokaika drik prada. Sarva bhagavata prana, Srimad Bhagavata Prabho, Kali, Dvanto Ditaditya, Sri Krishna Parivartate. Parivartata. Translation. Oh, Srimad Bhagavatam. Oh, nectar churned from the ocean. Oh, you who are enriched with the jewels of all spiritual philosophical conclusions. Oh, you who grant spiritual vision to all the people of the world. Oh, life breath of the Vaishnava devotees. Oh, Lord, you are the sun which has arisen to dispel the darkness of the Kali Yuga. You are actually Lord Krishna, who has returned among us. Now, this is all speaking, the O is addressing Srimad Bhagavatam and addressing the Srimad Bhagavatam as a person, you who see, he sees, Sanatan Goswami rightly sees Srimad Bhagavatam as a person, like the name, just speaking and hearing from Rupa Goswami about Vacha and Vachaka, the name and the person named, they're both persons. So similarly, the Bhagavatam is not different than Krishna. You are actually Lord Krishna, who has returned among us. That was his realization. Same Krishna Lila Stava. Paramananda Pataya Prema Varshi Akarshrayate Sarva Dasarva Sevyaya Shri Krishna Yand Namostute. O Srimad Bhagavatam, I offer respectful obeisances unto you. By reading you, one attains transcendental bliss. For your syllables rain pure love of God upon the reader. You are always to be served by everyone, for you are an incarnation of Lord Krishna. Again, Krishna has returned in the form of Srimad Bhagavatam. It's a literary incarnation. Of course, here it's speaking of reading. Our topic is hearing. But one who reads, and one who reads from a proper source, like Prabhupada described, then they'll narrate. And then there's both hearing and chanting going on. Another verse. Mad eka bandho mat sangin mad guru man mahadana man nistaraka mad bhagya mad ananta namostute. Again, addressing Srimad Bhagavatam. Oh, Srimad Bhagavatam. Oh, my only friend. Oh, my companion. Oh, my teacher. Oh, great wealth. Oh, my deliverer. Oh, my good fortune. Oh, my bliss. I offer my obeisances unto you. Now, one has friends. Sanatana Goswami certainly had friends, loving friends. But he saw Srimad Bhagavatam as the best of his friend. Here he's saying his only friend. But the Bhagavatam teaches us in a very gentle manner, and that's much to his liking. Good fortune. Sometimes one goes through a difficult stretch of time, and Sanatana Goswami is not unfamiliar with difficult times. Even to get the shelter of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, it was with difficulty. But Chaitanya Mahaprabhu taught that the Srimad Bhagavatam can bring all good fortune no matter what the circumstance. And this is the realization and the faith. Very nice verses glorifying the Bhagavatam by Sanatana Goswami. Now we're going up in disciplic succession a little further. Here's Chaitanya Mahaprabhu glorifying, hearing Srimad Bhagavatam. Always discuss Srimad Bhagavatam and constantly chant the holy name of Lord Krishna. In this way, you'll be able to attain liberation very easily, and you will be elevated to the enjoyment of love of Godhead, placed on an equal level or of great importance like the holy name. Lord Chaitanya came to deliver the Sankirtan movement, but it includes this discussing of Srimad Bhagavatam. Very, very unique literature. Not only during Sanatana Goswami's time and Lord Chaitanya's time is a very interesting description of the queens of Dwarka hearing Srimad Bhagavatam. So we know from Srimad Bhagavatam that just before Krishna's departure, he instructed from this world, before concluding his pastimes, he instructed his chariot driver Dwaraka to very quickly return to Dwarka. Krishna was very near Prabhas, return to Dwarka, inform all the residents there that the entire Dwarka will sink into the sea in 7 days. So they should vacate everything. And the queens, we know, were entrusted to Arjuna. We know this from the Bhagavatam, to bring the queens back to the place of protection, where they would be protected by the next king, Maharaj Parikshit. In turn, Maharaj Parikshit entrusted the care of the queens, 16,108 of the queens, to the great-grandson of Krishna, Vajranabh. So here's the text from, it's very similar narration of Skanda Purana and Padma Purana. It goes like this. After Krishna's departure from this world, his queens came to Mathura, where Vajranabha, Krishna's grandson, was protecting them. One day, while being tormented by the pain of separation from Krishna, they noticed that one of their co-wives, Kalindi, was not unhappy. She was very happy. So they asked her, what's the secret? How is it that you're maintaining such a happy demeanor? And Kalindi explained, the reason is, having heard from the happiness, the relief that the gopis received from hearing Srimad Bhagavatam, then I feel that contentment, just like the Braja Gopis, I heard that their contentment was made by that. So she suggested, Kalindi suggested, let us go to Vrindavan, because I heard that Uddhava, after Krishna's departure, he has become a blade of grass in Vrindavan. He was praying like that. Krishna granted him that benediction. And if we can find Uddhava, then he can describe Krishna's glories, just as he did for the gopis, and we'll be very happy. So this idea was very much liked by the queens, and they approached Vajranabh, who agreed. So Vajranabh invited Maharaj Parikshit to come with them, and together they all set out to Vrindavan to find Uddhava. And they had decided the way to find Uddhava was to have big Sankirtan festival. And the kirtan became so ecstatic that, much to their surprise, right from the grove of bushes and creepers, Uddhava appeared. And as he saw them ecstatically engaged, he was also feeling great ecstasy. Finding all of them absorbed in Krishna Kirtan, Uddhava offered his respects and embraced Maharaj Parikshit. Now again, what I've just described here is found both in Skanda Purana, the Vaishnava Kanda section of Skanda Purana, and the Bhagavat Mahatmya section of Padma Purana. That part is the same. The conclusion is slightly variant. We're going to go to the Skanda Purana version. So Uddhava suggested to Maharaj Parikshit, O king, you're most fortunate. You're always in exclusive devotion to Krishna. Among all the inhabitants of Dwarka, these queens are without a doubt most fortunate. Under the influence of Yogamaya, they have forgotten themselves and are suffering from anxiety caused by separation from Krishna. Unless Krishna becomes visible to them, none of them will regain their proper consciousness, but Krishna has wound up his pastimes. That time has finished, and now we have entered a different age. However, listen, and I will tell you another way to make Krishna manifest, and that's by narrating Srimad Bhagavatam. And so that's what happened. Uddhava, as was suggested by Kalindi, began narrating Srimad Bhagavatam, and the queens all became very, very happy. Now, the Padma Purana version says one by one the queens returned to the spiritual world. Now, this isn't in the Srimad Bhagavatam, but it's in the Skanda Purana and Padma Purana describing the glories of Srimad Bhagavatam. Srimad Bhagavatam is so glorious that it's manifested itself not only as the form that we have it, but many other forms. Here's one of them from Skanda Purana. Lord Krishna speaks the Bhagavatam to Lord Vishnu, Mahavishnu. And then later, Vishnu, Garbhadakshay Vishnu, speaks to the goddess Lakshmi. And as well, Lord Narayan speaks the Bhagavatam to Lord Shiva. Now, in our version of the Srimad Bhagavatam, Lord Narayana, or the personality of Godhead, imports knowledge directly into the heart of Lord Brahma. Here's some of the verses from the Bhagavatam that tell us that. Like these verses, the nutshell verses or the Chatra Shloki verses from Canto 2, Chapter 9, they're identified. Those of you that like to read the Bhagavatam, take note where these verses are, just how it's described, how the Bhagavatam was imparted to Brahma. And then, of course, Brahma imparted the same knowledge to Narada. And there's the verse, the text, Canto 2, Chapter 7, and Canto 2, Chapter 9. Narada then instructed Vyas, and as we know, Vyas compiled Srimad Bhagavatam, and he not only compiled Srimad Bhagavatam, but he wanted it to be proliferated widely, because after Krishna's departure, Kali Yuga begins and people need light from the Bhagavatam. So he instructed many students, but particularly so, he instructed Shukadev Goswami. After Shukadev Goswami left, following his birth, there was a very delicate arrangement to get him to come back and attend Vyasadev's school. Recitation of some very beautiful verses of the Bhagavatam did the trick. He came back and sat at the feet of his father and heard Srimad Bhagavatam extensively from his father. He studied diligently. And after some time, Shukadev Goswami then in turn spoke to Maharaj Parikshit. Now that's where we're most familiar. He spoke to Maharaj Parikshit, and in the audience somewhere over there is Sutta Goswami, and then in turn, Sutta Goswami spoke the same knowledge to the sages of Naimisharanya. Now these are some examples of Srimad Bhagavatam being narrated. In Brihat Bhagavatamrita, we find yet another very interesting one. After Srimad Bhagavatam is spoken by Shukadev Goswami, he wasn't immediately bitten by the snake bird, as you see in this image, but according to Brihat Bhagavatamrita, his mother, Uttara, immediately came and wanted to hear from her son what he had realized from hearing from Shukadev. And Maharaj Parikshit says, normally at times like this, one isn't asked to give a Bhagavatam class. But the subject matter is very wonderful. And so he narrates this entire part 1 of Brihat Bhagavatamrita. Very wonderful. And of course, back to Skanda Purana, this is Uddhava narrating Srimad Bhagavatam to the queens of Dwarka. We find in Canto 3, Chapter 8, Lord Sankarshan instructed Srimad Bhagavatam to the 4 Kumaras. This is the Kumara Sampradaya. And the 4 Kumaras, exactly described in the Bhagavatam, our Bhagavatam, the four Kumaras instructed the same Bhagavatam to Sankyayana Muni. And Sankyayana Muni had two disciples, among others, Parashara Muni and Brihaspati, directly found both in Srimad Bhagavatam and in Skanda Purana. And Brihaspati became the spiritual master of Uddhava. We hear that repeatedly, that Uddhava had as his spiritual master Brihaspati. This is the disciplic succession, not just demigod knowledge, it's knowledge of the Bhagavatam. That's what Uddhava learned from Brihaspati. And of course, Parashara Muni in turn instructed Maitreya Muni, directly indicated in our Srimad Bhagavatam. And in the same section, we find Maitreya instructing Vidura in transcendental knowledge in great detail. There's a local version or local tradition in Bhubaneswar and Amarnath that Lord Shiva spoke to Parvati and to Shukadev Goswami. So as you can see, there's lots of examples and of the Bhagavatam's importance, and it's being heard and discussed and taught in a number of different circumstances at a number of different times. It's such an important literature. One of the places that the Bhagavatam is glorified extensively, here are some examples, as you see in this painting, where Srimad Bhagavatam is being depicted in different times, in different places, by different persons. I'm going to describe very quickly the Gokarna story. Gokarna is a place in India, but it has its history of it, how it got the name. And the history is described in chapters 4 and 5 of Uttara Kanda of Padma Purana, which is part of a larger section of Bhagavata Mahatmya. And it's again, the focus is on hearing Srimad Bhagavatam. So this narration begins that there was a city along the banks of the river Tungabhadra that had become like a place of pilgrimage because so many elevated brahmanas resided there and engaged in their Brahminical duties very nicely. This is being told to Narada Muni. In that city, there was one Brahmana who was a Smarta Brahmana, whose name was Atmadev. And Atmadev, although a Smarta, he had acquired vast Vedic knowledge. He was hoping to have a qualified son with his good wife. Dunduli was his wife's name. And her beauty was something to behold, but she was always engaged in gossiping and was a little fault-finding kind of a personality and quarrelsome. And so it was a little difficult for Atmadev. But he tolerated it. She did her household duties very nicely. But in course of time, there were no children. Years passed, and there were no children. So Atmadev, out of frustration, decided to go to the forest and engage in austerities. And he was considering the worst. Maybe he should just give up his life, because what's the use of living a Brahmana's life with no issue? So as he was by the side of the river, one sannyasi came by and saw him in this very distressed condition. So the sannyasi asked him, what's the difficulty? And in the course of their exchange, Atmadev poured out his heart described the difficulties in his domestic matters, and said the real issue is, I have no son. So the sannyasi said, let me see your chart. Tell me your birth date. And he did it. He meditated upon his horoscope. And after some time, he told the Brahmin Atmadev, your chart says that for 7 lifetimes, you'll have no sons. And he was beside himself with anxiety. What's the use of life? Maybe I should just jump in the river and drown myself. So the sannyasi was trying to give him some good sense. And he narrated the story of King Chitraketu, which is from the Bhagavatam. And in the course of King Chitraketu's life, he had so many thousands of wives and no son. And the son that he had eventually gave him great difficulty and great disturbance because he died prematurely because the co-wives poisoned him. So just accept that you're not meant to have sons. But the Atmadev Brahmana was persistent. You're a sannyasi, you're very learned, you're an exceptional personality. Surely you must know something by which I can have a son. And so the Brahmana relented, the sannyasi relented, and he made the following suggestion. Here's a very special mango. You give this special mango to your wife, and she will be able to conceive a child. But to make this successful, she has to fast, observe strict fasting for 1 year. Amadev was very happy. He brought the mango back to his good wife, Dunduli, and Dunduli was kind of happy about mango, but she wasn't so happy about fasting for a year. So she was in kind of anxiety what to do. Fortunately, she had a sister, a younger sister, and the younger sister, she poured her heart out and explained the complication to her younger sister and what to do. So the sister said, I have a suggestion. I'm pregnant, and you can tell your husband and tell the people of the village, the sannyasi gave you a fruit and you've taken the fruit and very soon you'll have a child. And when my child is born, I'll give you my child and you can say it's your child. How does that sound? And Dunduli really liked the idea. She didn't like the idea of fasting for a year. So they decided to test the power of the mango by feeding the mango to a cow. Well, in 3 months' time, the cow gave birth to a young child, a male child, like a human-like looking child, but he had ears like a cow. And so they named the child Gokarna. Gokarna, the ears of a cow. And he became very, very nice, very learned, very Brahminical. And the child that was born of the cow, but that this is the son that was born of the sister of Dunduli, and his name was Dundukari. And he was just the opposite. He was very bad. Very, 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 very bad. He was so bad and wretched that Atmadev was too frustrated at trying to train him to be a good Brahmin boy. He left, went to the forest, underwent austerities, and according to the Bhagavad Mahatmya, he attained liberation. Leaving his mother, Dundukari's mother, Dunduli, with this wretched boy, and the wretched boy was too much. So she decided to take her own life. She threw herself into fire and died. Now that left Dundakari with a house that was previously occupied by his mother and father, and they weren't around anymore. So he occupied the house alone, and he occupied the house with prostitutes. And the prostitutes, of course, as he grew up, and to maintain the prostitutes, he was engaged in all types of criminal and illegal activities. And when the constables, the heads of the government of the king, came to know what Dundakari was up to, they went there, they arrested him, and they threw him into fire and killed him. Dundakari is no longer. But when the two boys were growing up together, they were friends. Gokarna and Dundakari were of the same age, and as little boys, they would play together and became very friendly with one another. Now, Gokarna was in this direction of a spiritually inclined young boy, or now young man. So when he heard that Dundakari had died this way, he went to, Dundakari had become a preta. That's the language that's used in the Padma Purana, Bhagavad Mahatmya section. Now, I'm not familiar with this word preta, so it's translated in different ways: evil spirit or phantom, not exactly a ghost, but he hung around with ghosts, according to this description. And he was troubling people all the time, including the people that he troubled was Gokarna. Now, Gokarna had gone on pilgrimage to holy places, and when he heard that his dear friend and like brother had died this way, he went to perform Pinda at Gaya for Dundakari's departed soul. And nothing happened as far as the relief, because Dundakari was troubling Gokarna wherever he went, and Gokarna was not fearful. He knew it was Dundakari. What would you like? What can I do that will please you? And Dundakari wanted to become freed from the sinful reactions because he had done so many sinful things. So the Gokarna, being a young Brahmin boy, he went to the great sages and he asked the sages, what should I do? Here's the circumstance. And they suggested that he worship the sun god. And so he worshiped the sun god diligently, intently. By the way, this deity is a deity of the sun god. And in Vrindavan, there's an ISKCON temple at the place where Surya Kund, where Radharani would go to worship the sun. It's a nice little temple, nice deity of this Surya Narayan. So the sun god appeared to Gokarna and said, what you need to do is recite Srimad Bhagavatam. And this will relieve Dundakari of all of his sins. So that's what he did. Gokarna made an arrangement for an assembly of the public, and he sat down to recite Srimad Bhagavatam steadily, uninterrupted for 7 days. Now, Dundakari didn't have a body, so it was a little awkward for him to attend the Bhagavatam recitation. So he concealed himself in a bamboo. And at the end of each day in the Bhagavatam recitation, a knot in the bamboo broke. And at the end of the 7th day of narrating the entire Srimad Bhagavatam, Dundakari became liberated. And as his soul was being lifted into the air, as you see in this little drawing, there's Gokarna with the cow ears giving recitation to Srimad Bhagavatam to a whole assembly of personalities. A Vaikuntha Vimana descended and took him to the spiritual world. And Dundakari pronounced his great gratitude to Gokarna for speaking Srimad Bhagavatam like this, because it was effective. It relieved him from all of his sins. Before he departed, Gokarna asked Dundakari, wait a minute, how come all the other people assembled here also didn't achieve the same result as you? And the answer Gokarna gave, or Dundakari gave, was they weren't listening intently like I was. When you hear Srimad Bhagavatam, you have to listen very intently, very attentively. Then you'll get the same benefit. And so off he went to the spiritual realm. So all the residents that were attending this Bhagavat recitation said, let's do it again. We'll listen very intently this time. And according to Padma Purana, at the end of the seventh day, many Vaikuntha Vimanas ascended and the whole assembly went to Vaikuntha. So this is a very nice description in a different text, literature, than Srimad Bhagavatam itself about the glories of hearing Srimad Bhagavatam directly in Padma Purana. Srila Prabhupada spoke about the importance of hearing Srimad Bhagavatam this way. As God is all light, all bliss, and all perfection, so also is Srimad Bhagavatam. And the personality of Godhead, as we heard from Sanatana Goswami, and we can hear it from other sources as well, the pages of Srimad Bhagavatam, with we hear Srimad Bhagavatam with rapt attention, Krishna will appear in every page of Srimad Bhagavatam. So we have to hear from the right source with rapt attention. And when we hear with rapt attention, so much benefit, all these benefits that we heard in Sanatana Goswami's Krishna Stavamala becomes yours. And maybe you'll meet Dunduli in Vaikuntha by hearing Srimad Bhagavatam with rapt attention. So there's our discussion for your Sunday program. How are we doing with time? We have some 10 minutes or so for discussion. Ramachandra, you want to take over and handle the question answer session?
Sure, Maharaj. Thank you very much. But before we go to questions, I'd just like to take a minute or so and just make a quick announcement. If that's all right.
Sure.
So, dear devotees, if you can see my screen really quick, our upcoming programs. This Wednesday, we will be announcing soon who the speaker is. Wednesday evening, our Wednesday Sangha program will continue virtually. July 18th is when we are restarting our preaching center in person. So stay tuned. We'll be having the flyers out. And this Jagannath Shravan Festival is ongoing. So you also have that information on the website, and other programs that we have. Our Friday Bhakti Riksha program, daily chanting from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. Bhagavad Gita readings, 15 minutes in between your busy work schedules. And Sunday school came to an end, so we are starting something virtually soon for the summer program. And stay tuned for our September registration. So at this point, if anyone has a question, please either you can type in the chat box. There's one question that's just come through in the chat box. Others can raise your hand or just unmute yourself. The question is, Maharaj, Parikshit Maharaj just heard Srimad Bhagavatam, but there was no loving service offered to Lord. Still, he got liberated. Could you please elaborate? If one just hears without offering any service, will that person will still attain liberation? I think Maharaj may have stepped
Someone
away.
say he didn't do service.
Could you hear me,
Maybe I've
Maharaj?
not understood the question. Maybe I've not understood the question, but his
Yeah,
life was a life of service.
yes. I think that's the clarification and the answer, Maharaj. That it's not that he didn't do
Okay.
service. Yeah,
Okay.
thank you. Thank you. Anybody else? Maharaj, what is the best way of studying Srimad Bhagavatam? There's so many verses, it may take a lifetime. Reading, some of us read a few verses daily, but by the time, a few months pass by, the rest is all forgotten. Any tips that you could share?
Ramchandra Prabhu, we can't hear you now.
Okay, I'm sorry. Maharaj is back. Maharaj, can you hear me?
Hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I can hear you now. We were disconnected and now reconnected. Can you hear me?
Yes, Maharaj.
Okay. So I don't, for whatever was going on when we were disconnected, I don't know what that was. If you want to repeat some of it, that would be helpful.
Sure. But again, your voice is cracking. Others, if you see the same, then please. Yes? Rupamati is nodding her head. Yeah.
I can hear you fine. Can you hear me fine without my voice cracking?
This time it's fine. We'll see how it goes, Maharaj. Maharaj, my
Okay.
question was that what is a good way of reading Srimad Bhagavatam? In the sense, we read few verses daily, but how can we study Bhagavatam? So many verses. How can we grasp Srimad Bhagavatam?
Well, best is with a teacher. And next best is with a reading group where you read and you share what you've read and some understandings and discussion. You churn the topics together. And next best, how much do you read at a time? Well, I don't know if it's so important if you read a few verses or a few pages. The most important thing is regularly. That's the instruction within Srimad Bhagavatam itself. Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya, regularly. So whatever you do, best is to do it regularly. And somehow, if you're doing, say you're doing Bhakti Shastri, but you also like reading Srimad Bhagavatam. So you read Srimad Bhagavatam in some consistent manner, as best you can, consistent manner. And when you complete Bhakti Shastri, you start looking for a teacher who can teach you Bhakti Vaibhav. Or, there are different ways that devotees have done this. They have very popular these days is reading groups. And it doesn't have to be like, a very elevated person who's teaching the Bhagavatam, but someone that can respond to questions and go through the Bhagavatam together, leading the discussion when it comes to discussion, but just reading together. What I'm saying here is there's different models, and ideal may not be something you can do. So then you take something that's just on a regular basis in the association of devotees somehow.
Thank you, Maharaj. Anybody else?
Hare Krishna Maharaj. Please accept my humble obeisance. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Maharaj, I was in the
Hare
same
Krishna.
line. Hare Krishna.
I can
The
hear you.
same-
Go ahead.
Maharaj, recently I was reading a short text, the conversation between the Srila Prabhupada and Professor Hopkins. And the question was, which of the books you consider the most important? And then Srila Prabhupada said, well, beginning with the first canto. Then Prabhupada said, go step by step. First of all, read Bhagavad Gita nicely. Then we get an idea of absolute truth. Then we can study Srimad Bhagavatam. So Maharaj, that means we need to first read Bhagavad Gita before start reading Bhagavatam.
When you know, if you just take that one sentence in isolation, then the answer is yes, because that's what the conversation says. But you take the much bigger picture of instructions of Prabhupada and even his practical practice. He had us, his disciples, and from the very early stages of Krishna consciousness, reading and studying Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam. 1970, morning Bhagavatam, evening Bhagavad Gita. So the answer to your question in that case is no. Or it can be yes. We don't know the context of what he was speaking, to the person to whom he was speaking, etc. He's speaking what sounds like a principle, but the application of that principle didn't apply to his own society's members. In addition, 1970, Nectar Devotion was published. We added a third class every day after lunch. Nectar Devotion every day. Here's another one. When Prabhupada was having his Bhagavatam cantos published, in addition to what the devotees would relish reading the new volume of the Bhagavatam, our book distributors, particularly the airport book distributors, would take cases and cases and cases of Bhagavatam and deliver the Bhagavatam to people. And they had no contact at all with anything. Not only no contact with anything, about third canto, part 4. And people would ask, what happened to the other parts? Prabhupada said, when they ask you that, you tell them, when you lick on ice cream, it's very sweet from any side. And so that's what we said, and people were happy. So the answer to one of the answers to your question is that's not necessary. But how Prabhupada was addressing that particular person, maybe it was suited for that particular person, can't say.
Thank you, Maharaj.
Anybody else has a question? While everybody's thinking, I just want to remind you that tomorrow's Ekadashi here in New Jersey area. So if you aren't aware of it, you are.
Prabhuji?
Yes. Yes, who's
Prabhuji?
speaking? Yes.
Okay.
Do you have a question?
We lost connectivity again. We're having some internet problems, but I can see you on his phone.
Okay.
All glory to technology when it works.
Anybody else? Any question? Maharaj, Srimad Bhagavatam, many of us have read or heard lectures, and some are taking Bhakti Shastri. I always encourage everybody who's doing Bhakti Shastri or initiated to at least come and speak what they've learned. But sometimes we feel that I'm not qualified enough to speak. So should we wait till we become qualified, or by speaking we become qualified?
You might have a long wait. And when does that qualified bell ring? Now I'm qualified to speak. That's not, so the other option is the option. This is how Prabhupada engaged us. And one may be humble, that's very nice. Prabhupada engaged us, in Madhyama activities, in Brahminical activities very quickly. It helped us to become qualified. Now, being humble about speaking what your realization is and not something fancy and trying to impress others or something like that, that's certainly good advice. But we speak to become qualified, not you become qualified and then you can speak.
Thank you, Maharaj. Yeah. There's another question in the chat box. Was Sanatan Goswami reading Bhagavatam while working for the Muslim king?
Oh, yes. He was a Vaishnava from his youth. He was a Brahmin Vaishnava from youth. He was an elevated person from youth. He would conduct Bhagavatam classes while running the government, the Prime Minister Nawab Hussain Shah. He had qualified Brahmanas speaking on the Bhagavatam topics. That's what happened when Nawab Hussain Shah came to see him when he said he was sick. They were discussing Bhagavatam. So the answer is yes.
Thank you, Raj. We should not jump straight to Krishna's pastimes in the 10th canto, but at the same time, we have the Krishna book. So sometime I had heard somebody say we shouldn't read that book or get into Krishna book before we get through the first 9 cantos. And there was a reason for having the Krishna book out now. So
Yes, there was.
Yeah.
And the Krishna book wasn't just for Hare Krishna devotees. The Krishna book was for the world. I mean, this question was, it hit the doubt button for many devotees because we were accustomed to hearing Prabhupada say, don't jump over the 10th canto can only be understood by first reading the first 9 cantos thoroughly. And, we had been primed. And then here comes Krishna book, 10th canto. So we were like, what? And Prabhupada wanted us, not just as devotees to read it, but to give to the public. And it was a big thing. It was a big book with a big Krishna across the top. How are you going to cover that one? And Krishna's picture, big picture of Krishna. So, one was how to convince people to read a book that says Krishna big in big letters across the top, but the other is how they're going to understand it. Prabhupada wanted the world that had misunderstandings of Krishna to get a proper understanding of Krishna. That was his purpose. And he didn't know if he was going to complete the 10th cantos. And so the 10th canto. And so he, went ahead and did Krishna book. It was very early in the movement, in the 70s. So the answer is you don't have to wait to study the first 9 cantos before you can read Krishna book to your kids. In fact, recommend that you do. They'll become very attached to it. They'll have their favorite stories and tell you the whole story and tell their friends.
Thank you very much.